Our Millennium actress transition came out of our initial research stage of the project when we were doing a deep dive into the filmography of Japanese animator Satoshi Kon. Kon's signature editing style relied predominantly on the use of jump cuts and match cuts, transitions that we saw reflected in a lot of other research material. Some of our research into his filmography went into the development of our gaze interaction and match cut sequences, but we also wanted to try and develop prototypes based on some of Kon's most evocative kinds of transitions, which utilize match cuts, jump cuts, and dissolves in ways that were practically impossible to achieve in live action. We eventually settled on adapting a particularly noteworthy transition from Kon's 2001 film Millennium Actress, which centers around an aging actress recalling events from when she was younger. The transition itself is essentially the visual thesis of the movie, taking the character on screen backward in time without necessarily cutting to an earlier time period. Kon does this by melding what is essentially a match cut with a dissolve, morphing the model of the actress as she shifts from older to younger. In first trying to translate this kind of transition into VR, we had to first think about how the character actually was going to move in a 3D space. The original sequence had the advantage of being essentially on a 2D plane, and so Kon was free to morph the central character from one side of the frame to the other without much movement, especially since the shot itself was a close-up. However, because VR doesn't have the benefit of shot lengths, and because the transition itself seemed to require movement, this made our application of the transition in the VR space much more challenging. To sidestep this, we made the design decision to map the movement of the character who initiates the transition to a guest's gaze, so when the guest moves their head left or right, the character follows. Additionally, we mapped the path of the character to the degree of the transition as well, meaning that as the character moved from left to right based upon the guest's gaze, the environment will also shift from one environment to the next. From a technical standpoint, we try to do the following. There are 3 cameras in the scene. The first 2 are slave cameras whose movements are synced with the headset. They both have their own camera rigs with their initial position and facing direction set up as desired, according to the story need. We then captured the 2 slave cameras' render result to temporary stereo textures, and we used special shaders to restore these textures' pixels' world coordinates and clip them out if it's needed by the transition effect. The third camera is the main camera. It doesn't actually do any rendering, as it only blends the 2 processed textures together according to the blending process, and then displays the final result back to the HMD. We made a VR prototype of Kon's original transition by creating an interior space reminiscent of the first part of the transition, and an outdoor train station that was similar to the last part of the final transition. We also iterated on the kind of transition that takes place when the character moves from point A to point B, these being a dissolve, a wipe effect like the one used in the Star Wars films, and a spreading transition, in which the transition begins on the character herself rather than the environment and then spreads radially outward. When playtesting this transition, we wanted to answer the following questions. How fast does the character need to move in order for the transition to feel natural? Should we adjust her speed linearly or exponentially based upon the speed of the guest's head rotation? Which kind of transition works best given the central mechanic of the prototype, a traditional dissolve, the wipe, or our spreading transition? How sensitive should the trigger be for the gaze on the character? Should we make it larger or smaller? From our playtests, we discovered that directly linking the speed of the character to a guest's head rotation gave people the impression that they were throwing the character using their head, rather than the character moving with their gaze. Most playtesters seem to prefer the usage of the dissolve over the other kinds of transition. While we found that the overall sensitivity of the gaze on the character was actually okay, we did adjust the initial trigger for the transition to be a bit more sensitive than its initial iteration. We fixed these issues not only by narrowing down our transition to simply a dissolve and adjusting the sensitivity of the initial trigger, but also by redesigning how the character herself moves in relation to a guest's gaze and head rotation. Because this transition involves a moving object, this movement is sourced as an animation clip. The animation plays back in its normal speed when we believe we have the guest's attention, and plays at a much slower speed when we don't, in order to reduce the chance of guests missing important story moments. We use the guest's head direction to estimate their attention, so if the direction of their gaze falls on the animated character's position within a certain threshold, we register this as having the guest's attention. The more the guests are looking away from their natural forward direction, the more forgiving the threshold will be. We were able to translate our prototype into the one found in our final version without too much iteration, though we did adjust the sensitivity of the overall transition and made the threshold for when the guests look away a bit more forgiving. So in summary, here were a few takeaways we learned about executing this transition properly. Dynamically adjusting the speed of the character's movement based on guests' attention seemed to work best, as it made both the character's movement and the transition appear both natural and relatively seamless. And with this kind of transition, dissolves work best, as the transition lends itself to emotionally fraught scenarios due to the character walking away from you by design. Feel free to play around with this transition yourself in our cutting-edge VR transition tool on GitHub, link in the description below.